I want to tell you about the afternoon I stopped believing the timeline. I was in the reading room of a medical archive in Edinburgh. One of those rooms where the silence itself feels institutional, where the cataloguing system on the shelves around you implies a confidence in the order of things that the documents inside sometimes don't support. I was working through a collection of hospital surveys from the 1830s, architectural plans, staff registers, construction accounts, the kind of material that usually reads as administrative background noise. And then I found something that shouldn't have been there. It was a floor plan, a plan of a hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio, dated 1831. A building of considerable scale, 4 pavilion wings arranged around a central administrative block, colonnaded corridors connecting the structures, a chapel at the eastern end, aligned in a way that suggested that orientation had been deliberate rather than incidental. The plan showed a drainage system of genuine sophistication, separate ventilation channels for the surgical and fever wards, a system of internal water delivery that implied plumbing infrastructure far more advanced than I would have expected from a frontier city that by all official accounts had only been incorporated as a municipality 22 years prior. I had seen that building before, not a similar building, not a building organized on similar principles. That building, the same pavilion arrangement, the same proportional relationship between wing length and corridor width, the same chapel orientation, the same drainage logic expressed in the same geometric terms, positioned at the same angular relationship to the primary axis of the site. I had seen it in a survey of the Imperial Military Hospital in St. Petersburg, Russia, dated 1802. I sat with those 2 plans for a long time. Then I started asking the kind of questions that, once you begin asking, you cannot find a reason to stop. The official history of institutional medicine is, on its surface, a coherent story. You learn about the ancient Greeks, about Hippocrates and the humoral tradition, about medicine as a practice of observation and balance. You learn about the medieval hospital as primarily a religious institution, the hospice, the almshouse, the place of shelter and prayer, rather than clinical cure. You learn about the gradual scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries, about anatomy and dissection, and the slow accumulation of empirical knowledge. You learn about Florence Nightingale in the Crimea in the 1850s, about the pavilion system of hospital design that she is credited with championing, about the transformation of institutional medicine in the second half of the 19th century, from what reformers of the period called the gateway to death into something recognizable as organized clinical care. It is a tidy story. It has a recognizable arc. It has heroes and turning points and a clear line of progress from ignorance toward understanding. But the deeper I looked, the more that tidiness began to feel like a kind of performance, like a story told too smoothly. Because when you actually look at the buildings, when you look at the plans that survive, the surveys that were conducted, the photographic record that begins in the 1840s and extends through the end of the 19th century, you encounter a problem that the official story does not address. The buildings were already there. Stand in front of the Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, founded, we are told, in 1751. Benjamin Franklin is on the founding board. The institutional charter exists. The administrative history is impeccably documented, or appears to be. What is less impeccably documented is the masonry of the east wing of the original building, the structure that stands on Pine Street, the oldest surviving hospital building in America, according to the plaques and the guidebooks and the institutional literature. Look at that building. Not at the founding documents, at the building itself. The stonework on the lower courses of the east wing is different from the masonry of the documented 1756 construction. Different in stone type, different in technique, different in the precision of the dressing on the face of each course. A stonemason I corresponded with, a man who has spent 30 years working with historic structures in the mid-Atlantic states, looked at the photographs I sent him and wrote back in a single sentence. That stonework on the lower level is earlier than the stonework above it, and I would not stake my professional reputation on how much earlier. He declined to be quoted by name. That response, I have found, is not uncommon. Let me take you to specific cases across a wider geography. The Charité Hospital complex in Berlin. Construction began officially in 1710, initially as a plague house on the outskirts of the city. By the mid-18th century, it had grown into one of the largest medical institutions in continental Europe. By the 19th century, it was world famous as a centre of clinical research. Look at the underlying geometry of its site, the orientation of the primary buildings, the relationship between the main administrative block and the secondary ward wings, the proportional logic governing the distances between structures. Now look at the plan of the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, the institution that claims to be the oldest continuously operating hospital in the world. Its current buildings date officially to the reconstructions of the 1860s and 1870s, but the site has been in continuous use since the 7th century. Look at the underlying site geometry. Now look at the plan of the Royal Hospital Chelsea in London, completed 1692, designed, we are told, by Christopher Wren. Now look at the plan of the Allgemeines Krankenhaus in Vienna, the General Hospital, founded officially 1784. Now look at the plan of the Imperial Military Hospital in St. Petersburg, 1802. Now look at the plan of that hospital in Cincinnati, 1831. And then look at the plans of the colonial hospitals of Sydney, Australia, the first permanent hospital structure on that continent. A settlement that by official account was a collection of tents and timber huts in 1788. A hospital with stone infrastructure within a generation. The geometry repeats, not the architectural style, which varies according to local tradition and official attribution. The underlying proportional logic, the ratio of pavilion width to corridor length, the relationship between the central administrative block and the outermost wings, the angular orientation of the surgical pavilion relative to the primary axis of the site. These are structural decisions embedded in the planning geometry before a single stone is laid. Decisions that require a level of institutional knowledge about hospital function that, by the official account, should not have been shared across building programs separated by ocean, by century, by hemisphere. How do you explain a hospital in a frontier American city that shares site geometry with an Imperial Russian military hospital, a medieval Parisian institution, and a colonial Australian facility, without a common source of architectural knowledge that those four programs demonstrably did not possess? The official explanation, when it comes, is always the same. Pattern books, the spread of institutional knowledge through European medical networks, the influence of John Howard's published surveys of prison and hospital conditions in the 1770s and 1780s, the dissemination of the pavilion principle through Jacques-René Tenon's 1788 report on Paris hospitals, the general diffusion of Enlightenment rationalism through educated administrators and philanthropic founders. I have read those books, many of them. They describe principles, they propose arrangements, they suggest orientations. They do not and cannot account for the specific geometric coincidences we see when we place these building plans side by side. A pattern book can tell you to separate surgical wards from fever wards. It cannot explain why a hospital in Cincinnati and a hospital in St. Petersburg share the same idiosyncratic ratio between ward width and corridor connection width, a ratio that does not appear in any of the planning manuals I have consulted. A pattern book can recommend pavilion planning. It cannot account for why the chapel orientation, the drainage gradient, the relationship between the north-facing utility wing and the south-facing patient wards follows the same angular logic in buildings constructed on three separate continents within the same half-century window. Something else is at work. I want to be careful here. I want to be precise because what I'm describing isn't a feeling or an impression. It is a measurable phenomenon. In 1821, Massachusetts General Hospital opened in Boston. The Bullfinch Pavilion, as it is now known, is a structure of extraordinary architectural ambition. a portico of Ionic columns, a dome, a facade that more closely resembles a national capital building or a treasury than what we conventionally imagine as a working medical institution of the early 19th century. We are told this building was constructed in a city of fewer than 50,000 people, in a period before anesthesia, before antisepsis, before germ theory. Built to serve a medical practice that had not yet established the clinical protocols that would have made such a facility's scale and sophistication rationally necessary. Why does a city of 50,000 in 1821, in a country less than half a century old, build a hospital whose architectural ambition equals the great public institutions of London and Vienna? The official explanation is philanthropic aspiration. Boston's civic leadership wished to express through architecture the ambitions of a new civilization. This is a reasonable explanation for why the building is grand. It is not an explanation for why the building works, for why the internal planning reflects a sophisticated understanding of patient flow and infection, management through spatial separation, for why the ward orientation relative to prevailing wind and light conditions is precisely calibrated, for why the relationship between institutional scale and staff circulation efficiency is embedded in the planning geometry in ways that anticipate clinical management principles that would not be formally articulated for another 40 years. That knowledge had to come from somewhere. Here is where the problem deepens in a direction I find genuinely unsettling. Florence Nightingale is credited with, among many things, the systematic application of pavilion planning principles to hospital design. Her notes on hospitals, published in 1863, are cited as the foundational text for what became the dominant model of hospital architecture in the second half of the 19th century. The Nightingale ward, the long single-story pavilion with windows on both long sides, beds in 2 rows, maximum natural light and cross-ventilation, nurses' station at one end, became the standard of institutional medicine for generations. I read her notes carefully. What I found was not a woman proposing innovations. I found a woman describing existing practice and arguing for its wider adoption. Her language throughout is the language of advocacy, of making the case that medicine should adopt principles she presents as superior to prevailing approaches. But the buildings she cites as exemplars of good design are, in multiple cases, buildings that existed long before her Crimean experience, long before her famous statistical work on preventable soldier mortality, long before the publications that made her a reforming authority. She is pointing at something already there. She is arguing that institutions should build the way certain institutions already built. This raises a question that the official history of nursing and hospital design consistently fails to ask. If the pavilion principle was, as the standard history tells us, a revolutionary innovation that transformed institutional medicine in the latter half of the 19th century, why do so many of the buildings constructed in the first half of the 19th century already reflect it with such precision? The Académie de Médecine in Paris conducted a survey of French provincial hospitals in 1848. The survey documented 23 institutions whose internal planning was found to conform to principles that the survey's own authors described as more advanced than the current state of theoretical understanding would suggest. I want you to sit with that phrase. More advanced than the current state of theoretical understanding would suggest. A French medical institution in 1848, surveying the hospitals of its own country and finding that the buildings embody more knowledge than the field that supposedly built them currently possesses. Not describing innovation, describing inheritance, describing the encounter with something already present that the profession is still working to catch up to. How is that possible? The evidence suggests something much larger than architectural ambition. The documentation problem is the thing I keep returning to. If these hospitals were designed by trained architects and medical planners working from a shared tradition, we should be able to trace the lineage. We should be able to follow the knowledge from teacher to student, from institution to institution, From the acknowledged centres of European medical learning to the frontier cities of America and Australia, where sophisticated hospital buildings appeared within decades of first settlement. That is how the history of institutional knowledge normally works. The names survive, the correspondence survives, the apprenticeship records survive, except when they don't. I found records of 3 hospitals in the American Midwest, major stone institutions, 2 still standing, whose founding documents reference architects who do not appear in any professional registry of the period. Names that exist in the founding documents and nowhere else. Names attached to buildings of considerable sophistication by men who, as far as the historical record is concerned, did not exist. I found a hospital in a provincial city on the Volga River in Russia whose earliest surviving administrative records date to the 1840s, but whose building, examined during a structural assessment conducted in the 1970s, was found to contain foundation elements that a Soviet-era archaeologist noted in a report that has since become rather difficult to locate, dated to a period significantly earlier than the institutional founding. The report is referenced in a catalogue index. The report itself is unavailable, noted in the system, present in the record, or simply not there. I found a provincial hospital in the south of Ireland whose cornerstone inscription gives a founding date that conflicts with a contemporary newspaper account of a dedication ceremony by a margin of 11 years. Not months, 11 years. The newspaper account describes a building already operating. The cornerstone claims it was that year laid. These are not clerical errors, these are structural contradictions in the documentary record. And the pattern of where these contradictions appear is not random. The silence was deafening. Let me talk about the sanitarium system because I think it is the most revealing part of this story. Between roughly 1850 and 1895, an extraordinary number of large residential medical institutions appeared across the United States, across Canada, across Australia, and across Central Europe. The sanitarium, distinct from the hospital, a facility designed for long-term residential treatment of chronic conditions, emerged in this period as a building type with no clear predecessor and an almost immediate architectural sophistication that the historical record struggles to account for. The Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan is the famous American example, but it is far from alone. The hydropathic establishments of the European spa towns, Baden-Baden, Karlsbad, Marienbad, were accommodating thousands. Purpose-built sanitarium campuses were appearing in the countryside outside major American cities within a time frame that, when you examine it carefully, does not align with the organizational and financial realities of frontier-era institutional development. What's strange about these buildings is not their scale, it's their siting. The sanitarium sites of the 19th century were not chosen randomly. They were chosen, in case after case, at locations with prior reputational significance, healing springs, elevated landscapes with particular air quality profiles, sites with existing folk traditions of therapeutic efficacy that predated the 19th century institutional record by generations, and in some cases by centuries. The waters of Karlsbad were known in the medieval period. The springs at Bath in England were known to the Romans, and evidence suggests they were known to populations before the Romans, who themselves described the site as already sacred when they arrived. What if the 19th century sanitarium builders were not choosing sites by rational hygienic analysis? What if they were choosing sites that already had a function, that were already understood within a tradition of knowledge about the relationship between landscape and human health, that predated the institutions that built upon them? And what if the buildings those institutions constructed were not original designs but inherited templates? Spatial arrangements carried forward from a tradition that the 19th century builders understood partially at best, well enough to recognize as effective, not well enough to explain why. This raises a simple but critical question. Who taught them to recognize it? In 2009, a historian of medieval hospital architecture named Carol Rawcliffe, published research documenting that the great English medieval hospitals, St. Mary of Bethlehem, the Hôtel Dieu in Paris in its original configuration, the Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, displayed spatial arrangements that conform with remarkable precision to what 19th century reformers would later call the Nightingale principles. Not approximations, not precursors, conforming arrangements. The standard academic interpretation of this finding is that medieval hospital designers understood intuitively what Nightingale systematized empirically, that the two traditions arrived at the same conclusions through different routes, but there is something in that interpretation that does not sit right with me. If medieval builders arrived at these spatial principles through intuition, and 19th century builders arrived at the same principles through empirical analysis, why did the centuries in between, the Renaissance, the early modern period, produce hospital buildings that largely abandoned those principles? Why would correct intuition be followed by a prolonged period of wrong practice, followed by the apparent rediscovery through science of what the intuition had already found? Unless the intuition wasn't intuition, unless the medieval builders were working from a tradition they had received rather than derived, a body of knowledge already old when they inherited it, a set of spatial principles whose logic they applied without fully understanding, the way a craftsman applies a technique they were taught without knowing the physics that make it work. And unless the 19th century rediscovery was less an innovation than an act of recovery, of finding again through the methods of empirical science what had at some earlier point been fully known through methods we no longer have access to. The official explanation collapses here, not dramatically, quietly, under the accumulated weight of its own exceptions. I spent time corresponding with a structural engineer who specializes in the assessment of 19th century hospital buildings, a professional whose credentials are unimpeachable and whose name I will not use here because she did not agree to be cited. I described what I had been finding without framing it as anything other than an architectural history question. Her response was careful and precise. She said that many of the 19th century hospital buildings she had assessed showed what she described as environmental performance characteristics that exceeded what their design period would lead her to expect. Natural ventilation performance beyond what the window placement alone should produce, thermal mass behavior that stabilizes internal temperature in ways that modern analysis has difficulty fully modeling. Acoustic separation between wards that appears to exceed the separation that the physical materials would predict. She said that in some cases, the buildings outperformed their 20th century successors on criteria that the 20th century successors had been specifically designed to address. This is not a fringe claim. This is a structural engineer describing her professional findings. The buildings work better than they should, not in every case, not uniformly, but with enough consistency across enough institutions in enough countries that she had, she told me, thought seriously about writing it up formally, and then not done so. I asked her why not. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I wouldn't know where to begin explaining it." The silence was deafening. There is a specific quality to the period 1870 to 1900 in the history of hospital construction that I want to draw your attention to, because it is the same quality I have noticed in the history of church construction, of public library construction, of courthouse and railway station construction across the same decades. In this compressed window across the Western world, the great hospital building programs of the 19th century essentially complete themselves. The major institutions that will define public medicine for the following 100 years are built, endowed, and set in operation. And then what follows is different, not in scale, but in character. The hospitals built in the 20th century are built in a different idiom, steel and concrete and glass. The functional modernist medical facilities stripped of the architectural ambition that characterized its predecessors. And here is what I notice. The great 19th century hospitals, the ones that share the geometry, the ones whose planning logic repeats across continents without adequate documentation, those buildings are still standing, most of them. And when you visit them today, when you walk the colonnaded corridors and stand in the domed atria and look at the proportions of the walled facades, they feel different from their 20th century successors in a way that is not purely aesthetic. They feel as if they were designed to do something that the 20th century model stopped doing, not something mystical, something practical and forgotten. And the period 1870 to 1890 is also, as I have noted in other contexts, the period of maximum institutional consolidation. The period when Western governments in city after city established formal systems of building records and land registries and historical documentation. The period when the story of the built environment was for the first time systematically written down, fixed, made official. And what was fixed and made official was, in most cases, the story that what existed had been built recently by known architects for documented patrons on previously undeveloped sites. Before that story was created, something else was the de facto understanding. Something less tidy, something that left room for questions that the official record was now systematically closing. Let me try to say something true about what I think we might be looking at. Not a conspiracy, not a secret medical brotherhood encoding its knowledge into stone. Something more interesting and more melancholy than any of that. The loss of knowledge. It happens. We know it happens. The Roman concrete, a material of such sophistication that modern engineers spent decades attempting to reverse engineer its self-healing properties from surviving structures, was genuinely lost after the collapse of the Western Empire and genuinely recovered only in the 20th century. The surgical knowledge of the classical world, the pharmacological understanding of the Arab medical tradition, the navigational knowledge of the Polynesian peoples, multiple documented cases of sophisticated bodies of technical knowledge that were lost completely, leaving behind only artifacts that demonstrate capabilities we struggle to reconstruct. What if something like that happened, at a much larger scale, and not only to medical knowledge, but to the integrated body of knowledge that produced these buildings? A tradition that understood geometry not as an aesthetic system, but as a functional one. A tradition that knew how the orientation of a room affects the body inside it, how the relationship between a building and the path of the sun and the direction of the prevailing wind is medically significant in ways that the 19th century was in the process of rediscovering and the 20th century has largely abandoned again. And what if that tradition was interrupted, not erased by deliberate conspiracy, but lost through the ordinary catastrophes of history, plague, conquest, the simple entropy of civilizational collapse? And what we call the 19th century hospital building boom is, in part, the story of a newer civilization encountering the remnants of that older tradition, inheriting its sites, inheriting its spatial logic and its orientation principles, writing itself into those buildings' histories because the buildings were already there, or because the knowledge that produced them was already embedded in the landscape, waiting to be recovered by anyone patient enough to find it. Because that would explain everything. The identical planning geometries, not independently derived but inherited from a common source. The missing documentation, there was no documentation to create because the knowledge preceded the record-keeping systems that would have captured it. The extraordinary speed of institutional development in frontier cities, the buildings or the knowledge that produced them, were already there waiting. The official explanation collapses here, not because I have a better definitive answer, but because the official explanation requires us to believe that a civilization in the process of industrializing, in the process of establishing the scientific foundations of modern medicine, in the process of settling continents that had been wilderness within living memory, somehow simultaneously produced hundreds of large, sophisticated, stone medical institutions that reflect functional knowledge about the relationship between built space and human health, that the field that supposedly built them had not yet formally established, and that none of this is worth examining more carefully. I don't find that credible. Not anymore. I go back sometimes to those two floor plans, the hospital in Cincinnati and the hospital in St. Petersburg sitting side by side on a reading room table in Edinburgh. And I think about everything those plans imply. If those two buildings share a common origin, not a common influence, a common origin, then someone somewhere once understood how to build for healing in a way that crossed every boundary we now consider fundamental. Language, culture, ocean, the newly settled frontier and the imperial capital. And that understanding was so precisely transmitted or so widely distributed that it appears without meaningful degradation in buildings separated by thousands of miles and, by the official account, entirely different institutional traditions. I think about the engineer who told me the buildings work better than they should and then declined to write it up. I think about the Soviet archaeologist report that appears in a catalogue index but cannot be located in its original form. I think about the architects whose names appear in founding documents and nowhere else in the historical record. I think about the sites chosen by 19th century sanitarium builders at locations already understood, within traditions much older than their institutions, as places of healing. I think about the millions of patients who have recovered in these spaces, in the colonnaded pavilions, in the wardrooms with their calibrated solar orientation, in the domed atria that distribute light in ways that the people who designed them understood and we have largely forgotten to ask about. Recovered perhaps in part because of something in the geometry itself, something encoded in the spatial relationships of these structures by people who understood what those relationships do to the human body under stress. Something we no longer think to ask about because we have been told it was never known. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. There is a tradition in these buildings. It runs through hospitals in Boston and St. Petersburg, through sanitariums in Michigan and healing springs in Bohemia, through medieval infirmaries in Florence and frontier medical facilities on the American interior, through colonial institutions in Sydney and the hydropathic establishments of Central Europe. It is precise, it is consistent, it is world-spanning, and it is officially not there. The deeper I go, the more clearly I can see it, and the more clearly I can see it, the less I'm satisfied with the silence that surrounds it. A silence maintained through the comfortable vagueness of institutional history, through the professional prudence of engineers and historians who noticed something and decided, for entirely understandable reasons, not to write it up, through the systematic fixing of the official record at precisely the moment, in precisely the decades, when the questions these buildings generate were most urgently in need of asking. The buildings are still standing, most of them. They are still working, in some of them. Patients still move through corridors whose proportional logic was established by hands we cannot identify. Wards still fill with light along orientations whose significance the people who sleep in them are no longer taught to understand. The healing tradition that produced them is officially considered accounted for. I am no longer certain it has been. I'm still looking.